Greetings out there in podcast land, everybody. This is Benny and Dan coming at you with another live episode of Jewanced. Dan, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. Spent the afternoon in a bunch of covidial situations that I would have rather not been in, like at the dentist with my daughter, which is always fun.
Covidial.
Covidial. I don't know how to say it. We're living in crazy times.
We're coining it.
Basically, she had a tooth that had a cavity. She's afraid of the dentist. A year of going back and forth to dentists where she basically makes them regret ever going to dental school as she's sitting there in the chair with them in the office, and it's like they go in for it, and she's as if someone's like murdering her. She can't deal with it. Finally today we took her to somewhere where they gave her like some drugs that I'd like to get my hands on, but that's neither here nor there. And she's doing much better. So
glad to hear.
You got a little limp here. He's got like a goat beard, and it gets stuck. No, it's just gray hair. Oh, I'm sorry.
I have gray hair, dude.
Sorry, it's just gray hair.
I thought you were like, I can deal with gray hairs. I can't deal with lint in my beard. That's like crossing a border there.
Anyways, so yeah, it's been a good week. I would say that the time is moving by pretty quickly. We're at the end of November. Thanksgiving was great.
Unbelievable. We had a nice Thanksgiving together.
We did.
We had a full traditional hour for those listeners. Benny and I are old friends, so our tradition on Thanksgiving is to do it. We do it on Shabbat here because we don't get Thanksgiving Day off like in America. But we have the full meal, full turkey, and cornbread and mashed potatoes and gravy and the whole thing, and it's nice. It's really nice. And we've been doing it for a couple of years with an Israeli family that has also adopted Thanksgiving as one of their holidays, and I'm glad we got to have it this year together.
All right. We got maybe a little sound issue here. Can you hear us now?
Better. Thank you.
Okay. You just got to speak into the mic.
Got to speak into won't happen.
Yeah, we got together, but it was okay. We were safe about it, and our families kind of see each other anyways throughout this entire thing. So we were fine. I don't think we really talk about this that much, but I mean, I want to say congratulations to anybody that's listening that's had a hard time this year. It's November 30th. We've been through this thing now for, what is that?
Well, since March.
Yeah, like 9 months. So if you're listening, you survived 9 months. Give yourself a pat on the back. It's a big deal. We're still here, and
it's not going to end just because the calendar year flips, right? We're going to still be in.
I realize. I'm just saying, like every day, every day, we're good.
All right.
We got a great one for you guys today. Dan, I'll let you introduce our guest, but I just want to let everybody know that I'm very, very happy that we have a representative of this organization on the podcast today, because I've been hearing a lot about this organization for off and on for the past 20 years. Dan does a lot of work with them, and without further ado, Dan, go ahead.
Well, without further ado, and we will introduce our special guest, Melanie Pell, here in just a second here of the AJC. But before we do, we have a couple of announcements.
We do have a couple of announcements. So first off, check it out. Jewanced is a listener-supported podcast. We have been growing by leaps and bounds. We have listeners on over 6 continents.
Over 6 continents?
Well, there's probably some islands and outlying places, but
what's over 6? Nearly almost 10 years.
Yeah, nearly almost 10 years.
Yeah.
So we rely on listener support from people just like you. And if you care to see our podcast grow further,
if you want to keep this magic going from week to week,
we encourage you to please make a one-time donation on our PayPal account. You can make a contributing ongoing contribution to our Patreon account,
for which we do promise Jewanced swag in the near future.
And if you're a business or an organization you'd like the podcast on our platform, please let us know. Visit us for more information at www.jewanced.com. And something new that we're going to be doing right now, announcing for the first time, introducing Jewanced live podcast and guest panels, the perfect solution to presenting intriguing Jewish and Israel-related content, custom crafted to engage your community or organization's members and impart a meaningful and memorable experience. Are you looking to creatively engage your community? Jewanced Live is the perfect solution for you.
So basically, just like on the show, Benny and I are, we tend to be engaging, inquisitive, witty, maybe, in person also. And we can bring our unique talents for bringing out complexity, nuance, and captivating content from guests and it doesn't end here at our studio door. So whether you're interested in us hosting a live dedicated podcast with audience participation, it can be virtual or in person, or having us moderate your organization or community's next panel event, we've got you covered. So with our extensive network of connections to a range of fascinating guests on a broad range of topics, let us know. Reach out to us through our website, www.jewanced.com, and book us for your next live event.
So thank you very much, Dan. And without further ado, Dan, take it from here.
So yeah, I'm really happy to introduce an old friend, and I'm glad I can say that. Not that you're old, just we've known each other for a few years now.
Okay.
Melanie
I earned it. I earned my age.
I'm the one with the gray hairs in my beard, apparently. So happy to introduce our guest, Melanie Maron Pell, who is the Managing Director of the AJC, the American Jewish Committee's 24 regional U.S. offices. You'll tell us what that all means in a second. Melanie and the AJC have been doing fantastic work for a long time in the Jewish world, in the advocacy world, in the Israel sphere. And we've been wanting to have you on the show since we started this, and this is a perfect opportunity to do it. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. I'm delighted. I'm so glad we made this work. It's good to see you guys.
Likewise.
Likewise.
And normally we'd be seeing each other, meeting groups in hotels and running around
in Israel.
Conferences.
I can't wait.
Hopefully soon enough.
Hopefully soon.
Where are you coming at us from?
I'm in Louisville, Kentucky.
Yes.
Nice.
Which is my hometown, born and raised. I moved away. I lived away for a number of years, but returned in 2013.
2013. So
okay.
In honor of Kentucky, we will raise a glass of bourbon for you.
Hi.
And
hey,
for anyone that it's 5 o'clock somewhere, you're welcome to.
That's right.
How is it to move back home after a lot of years away?
Well, I did it fully voluntarily, so it was very much by choice. I grew up here, born and raised here. And my Kentucky origin story, I like to joke that I'm first generation Kentucky, because I am. My parents are New Yorkers, and they moved here in 1971. My dad got a teaching position at the University of Louisville. So my brother and I were both born here, but to New Yorker parents. So even though I can do the accent, if you want to hear it, I can totally do it. But our joke was that we did not speak Kentucky in the home.
Is it
my parents are New Yorkers.
Syrup?
What?
Maple syrup?
Syrup, maple syrup. I say syrup, but again, I remember growing up, my parents saying, it's dog and coffee. And
yeah.
Dog, coffee, Florida, come on. So I grew up here. I moved to Chicago for law school, went to law school in Chicago, started working for AJC. 2021 will mark my 20th year with AJC, which is kind of amazing. Wow. So I started right out of law school, and then I lived in Chicago for a number of years with AJC. Then I moved to DC. I was in DC for a number of years. And then in 2013, my husband, who I met living in DC, he was hitting 20 years with the Anne Arundel County Fire Department where he could retire. And that was a moment for us. And we thought, gosh, if we want to raise a family, where would we do that? And I always thought.
Take a step back. Your husband's a firefighter?
Yes, I found it. I married a Jewish fireman.
Awesome.
Awesome.
So awesome.
It is. He's retired now, but yes, it is. It's great.
Is he the Pell?
He's very, very handy. Like we used to joke that he should have Ken Pell's School of Practical Judaism, where he taught people how to fix a leaky sink and change a tire.
Anyway,
so, in 2013, we made the decision. My parents are here in Louisville, and one of the things that that sort of inspired it was my husband saying to me, the only time I ever see you relaxed is when we go to Louisville. So I thought, that's interesting. So we moved back here in 2013. Our son was born here, and it's been great, actually. I have to say, I've been working from home since before it was cool, or before it was the thing everyone had to do. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of pioneering what that's like to get your act together every day and be productive and functional from home. But I love it, and I feel very, very lucky, and I can say a few words if you'd like about why I feel so lucky. AJC has been really good to me when it comes to allowing me to make my life where I needed to be, and really have an amazing career.
So I think before we go any further, maybe just let's explain to everybody who's not aware, what is AJC? And
yeah, we've got the alphabet soup of Jewish organizations, 3-letter
Yes.
acronymed Jewish organizations. I think just before we jump into that, I think it's always cool. We've talked about this a few times of trying to find this work-life balance. And we're kind of in this age where I think COVID is showing people, hey, you can work from home if it suits you. My boss doesn't let me work from home on one of my 20 jobs right now, but I'm all for it, and I'm all for, how do we find a work-life balance and spend the time with the family we need. And, if it suits you to, work in the mornings and take the afternoon off and get back to work at night after the kids are asleep, which is kind of how I live my life. I'm all for it. But yes, let's get into the AJC. So what is the AJC? And then we'll kind of try to map it out on this, the list.
The alphabet soup, which, by the way, I will get to AJC in one moment, but I have told Jewish audiences before, it's confusing enough when you're within the Jewish community to try and understand the alphabet soup. Imagine our poor friends outside of the Jewish community who are trying to understand, how does this all work? Why are there so many? We are hyper organized as a community, but it's a strength, I would say. So AJC is the American Jewish Committee. We advocate for Israel and the Jewish people around the world and in the United States, and we defend human rights for all. That's sort of us in a nutshell. We've been described as the State Department of the Jewish people, which is one way to think about us. So we engage both in the US and abroad through diplomatic advocacy, political advocacy, through extensive media, a really impressive media shop, and through a really remarkable long-standing network of intergroup and interreligious relationships. And this is work we've been doing since 1906. So we've been in this business for a long time. And we are fiercely nonpartisan, very centrist, very nuanced, probably too well kept of a secret. We try to not be as much of a secret as we, for many years, we would talk about how everything was very diplomatic and our work was quiet. Much of it still is, but
we're not going to tell.
We want to make sure people understand who we are and what we do. And so my piece of this is that I oversee our network of 24 US offices that we have around the United States.
So you started in 1906. This is before there's an Israel.
I didn't start in 1906.
I mean, not you. Not you.
Yeah.
We're old friends. Not
yes.
like that. You're not. So the AJC started in 1906, not to be confused with the other AJC.
Correct. Right? Which came later.
With the American Jewish Congress.
Whoa. There's 2 AJCs.
There's 2 AJCs.
There's 3 if you count the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which is the paper of record in Atlanta, Georgia.
Right. The mistake I made today when trying to tag the AJC on Twitter was that there is the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who has the Twitter handle AJC.
Is there a team at the AJC who's working on this problem?
Our Atlanta office, they deal with it every day. And Godspeed to them. They do a great job. So the American Jewish Committee was founded in 1906, predominantly by German Jews, and the American Jewish Congress came a little bit later, predominantly by Russian Jews of Russian origin. And there were a number of, here's something I will say about the sort of great alphabet soup of Jewish organizations. From my perspective, there is enough work to go around. If anti-Semitism were such an easy problem for just one organization to tackle, then we would have fixed it by now. So, I am of the belief that the Jewish community benefits from having a multitude of organizations. Not every organization is right for everyone. The American Jewish Congress, sadly, was really decimated by Bernie Madoff. They still, exist in some form or another, but it is a dramatically reduced version of what they once were.
Right. You don't hear a lot about them anymore. That's the alphabet soup.
That's a tricky one, right? I mean,
it is.
Madoff.
So in 1906,
that guy was a Jew. Like, come on, man.
I know. And to AJC, to the American Jewish Committee's credit, I must say, we apparently I wasn't part of any of those conversations, but we steered clear of Bernie Madoff. We were, approached, but we were not impacted, thankfully.
Does anybody stop for a second to think like the guy's last name was Madoff? Madoff.
It was meant to be. He had
like his name was Madoff. You gotta. No, but
surely someone has thought of that. I don't know. But.
Stick to podcasts, not comedy.
Interesting. What other secrets can we reveal?
I'm a dad. That was a dad joke.
It's true. That was a dad joke. So wait, so it's 1906 and the early years. What is the AJC working on, and then kind of what are you guys working on today?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and our archives you can find online, ajcarchives.org, and they're fascinating because you can go through and read early minutes of those first meetings, which are fascinating. And in fact, as director of regional offices, to me, what is also incredibly interesting is that when the regional office system started in the 40s, that was when the founders, and I'll get to the founders in a moment, but when they recognized that they needed sort of eyes and ears and voices and advocates and constituents on the ground around the country, the conversations they were having then are very similar to some of the conversations we're having now. You know, like we need people from different, we need to be represented around the country. We need younger people, all the same kinds of conversations that we still have today. So in 1906, it was a group of, it was really a committee. It was a small group of, it was all men at the time, and they were business leaders, largely, not all New York, but, it was sort of East Coast centric. And they were concerned about pogroms against Jews in Tsarist Russia. And we're reaching out to the US government and saying, how can we use our influence and be influential and try and assist our brethren in another part of the world. And so it was really that impulse and desire to help Jewish communities around the world that was the impetus for the founding of AJC, and that still very much animates so much of what we do today. But in addition, very early on, the founders recognized that if we weren't also speaking out for other communities that were facing their own challenges, other minority communities, that we weren't going to be able to protect ourselves. And, history has proven time and again that, while bigotry and prejudice may not always start with the Jews, eventually it will come to us. Very often it does start with us, but, if it doesn't start with us, it will get to us eventually. And so it's both self-interest, but also because our values, demand.
Was that revolutionary for its time? The idea of, let's create awareness of other people's similar problems or ally ourselves with other marginalized communities in order to create it's not necessarily a Jewish problem, it's a problem of prejudice, a humanity
against problem,
minority.
It's an interesting question. It's a really good question too. I'm trying to think, are there examples of organizations that were similarly oriented in 1906 or prior? Perhaps there were. I don't know that there were any that, B'nai B'rith was around, but I don't know that B'nai B'rith was engaged in quite as much of the intergroup work. So for example, the first amicus brief, friend of the court brief that AJC filed was, I believe it was 1914. It was on behalf of Catholic parents who wanted the right to send their kids to Catholic parochial schools. And, it was a recognition again, that if Jews want to educate their kids in Jewish schools, there's a parallel here.
Sure.
AJC also, throughout our history, we have these, our fingerprints and our involvement with so many of the sort of pivotal civil rights moments. So for example, AJC funded the research study by Kenneth Clark that was the underpinning of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And the study, what he showed is that separate but equal is not in fact equal. And so that was the research was the basis for the desegregation of schools.
Interesting.
So AJC funded that. AJC also helped found early on, back in I think it was the 1920s, the NAACP. And there were, some AJC leaders involved in that. So we have recognized that we are responsible for one another's well-being and safety. And then also, certainly, again, like we as a community can't thrive if other minority communities are being persecuted or suffering. So it was both looking abroad and making sure Jewish communities here and abroad were protected, but then also looking at the values that again, motivate and animate the Jewish people and making sure that everyone was protected and that human rights for all were protected.
And I think your question's even more interesting, to think that back then, American Jews, even though German American Jews were already assimilated pretty much by that point, Jews were not as integrated into the fabric of American society as they are, from the 50s and 60s onwards. So to think,
right, it's not post-war.
Right. So to think that American Jews already then, even if it's the German ones who had already been in the United States for a few decades, and had already pretty much established themselves and were no longer the immigrant class, that they had this kind of thinking, and I would be curious to know if other kinds of groups, immigrant groups, were doing this at the time. And it's a really interesting question. But yeah, I guess that takes a lot of foresight to kind of at that time to come out with this vision and this kind of plan of civic action, I guess you could call it, that AJC was doing already then. I know if we jump to the kind of 30s and 40s and, into the early years before the State of Israel and then after, the AJC at the time, if I'm not mistaken, was not a Zionist organization, correct?
That's correct. Early, in our early days, we were not there, and again, it was a lot of that, the largely assimilated leadership, and there was a range of agreement, disagreement on this. I think it was really World War II that, everyone realized, like, we really need the State of Israel. But it is part of our history. It is part of our history that, we have to acknowledge. I think we've come quite a long way since then in terms of being an incredibly strong supporter of the State of Israel. And it is central to our work now. But no, in the early days, AJC was not a Zionist organization.
What was the famous,
was it an anti-Zionist organization?
I don't know if I would frame it that way. I think
not
it was
anti-Zionism, of course, the way that we think of it today with people that are fighting against Israel.
In the 30s and 40s, if I'm not mistaken, the non-Zionists, I don't know if they're the non-Zionists, which were, the Reform Jews at the time, the assimilation, the kind of more assimilationist stream, they're like, no, we're American, we're assimilating into America. And it had ideologically, we see that it didn't last because everyone kind of came back to Zionism, but gave up that idea of that our promised land, our ideal state, is going to be somewhere else. It's going to be in what was then known as Palestine. It's going to be in historic Israel. We're Americans, we're not that. That's not for us.
Right. So, and if you go into Europe, you're talking about people that were in the Bund or people that were.
Well, that was a different stream altogether, but right. Of
course. And
then you have the famous Blaustein-Ben Gurion agreements, right? I forget exactly what year that was, but 49, 50, that said, we're not going to recruit for Aliyah in the United States, and American Jews said, we're not going to tell Israel what to do, basically. Kind of like a pact of, mutual respect and, demarcation lines. By the way, I see Aryeh Sullivan is joining us, our mutual friend. So we're going to raise l'chaim to him.
L'chaim. Aryeh.
How you doing?
Miss him too.
So that's really interesting. So when does the AJC kind of make this shift and then start becoming what is known today as a pro-Israel advocacy? It's not all you do, but among the things that you're doing.
Yeah, I think obviously the Shoah, World War II, seeing what happened, there was a recognition that this was critically important for the future of the Jewish people, and that it was more than just aspirational. It was something that was absolutely essential and necessary. And then I think there was a real shift in terms of feeling this great pride in the achievements of tiny and mighty Israel, and recognizing that Israel was an incredible success story and a miraculous story for the Jewish people. And that, again, certainly continues to animate so much of our work. Like, I would say so much of our work now, our diplomatic work, is spent. We spend a lot of time and energy these days still combating anti-Semitism, which is, again, as I said, sadly,
there's enough work for everybody.
Yes, it is a shapeshifter of a problem. So it continues to morph and find new ways to, it's kind of like water, right? Like it'll find a way in. So a never ending source of
It really
of
is.
work for us. What's that?
It really is a shapeshifter of a problem.
Yeah, it is.
I actually heard it referred to in that way today. I was listening to a podcast with Barry Weiss, and she like deliberately referred to anti-Semitism.
Really? Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, the other thing that like
Sachs, Alava Shalom, Sachs
yes.
has described it that way numerous times, and I've used it in my lectures, that it, you know, whatever is, excuse me, whatever is the moral standard of that day, whether it's religion or science or, you know, if you're in a communist place or if you're in a capitalist place, then the Jew is always whatever is hated in that place, and it always kind of
whatever is bad.
Yeah.
So as a centrist organization or a apolitical organization, how does today's polarized? I mean, this is a huge question. We'll get to it later. But in terms of anti-Semitism, I want to ask, just in terms of anti-Semitism, I mean, you're seeing it in America, and when we're in Israel here, so we're very much, I don't know what word to use. We don't experience it. We hear of it. We don't experience it in Israel.
Yeah, you're in a majority culture, so the only majority culture for Jews. But
you're finding yourself now in a place and time where it's coming from every different angle, and there's a society that, you know, in a society that exhibits itself, that exerts itself, it's a society that has problems. It's not in a healthy place, and that I'm sure makes your work that more urgent and that more challenging.
And also that it is why, and our CEO David Harris has been saying for years, we have to call it out wherever it's coming from. So whether it's coming from the far right, which is, you know, sort of, I hate the thought of traditional anti-Semitism. Like, to me, like, I don't even like saying it that way. It just sounds so wrong.
New age anti-Semitism.
Just right. You get my point. You know, there's sort of the far right, there's the neo-Nazi, there's sort of classic anti-Semitism. And then there's the more, you know, the breed we see that is now emanating from the far left and from many progressive circles.
In the
not
guise
all,
of anti-Zionism, right?
Yeah, right. Where it manifests mostly as anti-Zionism, but not always. Sometimes it's just outright anti-Semitism. And then there's, you know, Islamist, like the sort of stream of Islamist ideology, where we see another breed of anti-Semitism. And then we see, you know, we used to say, David, our CEO, would say, we need a trifocal lens. So we have to see it from the left and from the right and from, you know, this sort of, again, narrow faction, but significant stream of Islamist ideology. But then last year, we started seeing all of these attacks against the Orthodox community in Brooklyn, for example.
New York.
Where people are being attacked on the street because they, you know, they're very visibly wearing their Judaism very visibly. There's no political ideology there, right? Like, that is not far left or far right. Like, there's nothing going on there that we can attribute to political ideology. It is apolitical, but they're still being attacked because they're different.
A lot of it was coming from the African-American community, right?
Some of it. And that has been, you know, there's been a lot of sort of unpacking and you know, engagement, first of all, with the Black community, with the Hispanic community particularly in Brooklyn. But the trifocal lens isn't enough. Like, we need a 360-degree lens, because it really can come from so many different sources, and the strategies we use to combat it have to be different for each of those sources. They can't, you know, there's not one answer to this. There's not one way to combat anti-Semitism. So we actually just, we hired a phenomenal director of combating U.S. anti-Semitism in the U.S., Holly Huffnagel, who has been with us now for, she's been with AJC for a couple of years in her new role for maybe a year, but
wasn't there a little bit of criticism? I said, wasn't there a little bit of criticism that I don't know who it was coming from, but I remember reading that she's not Jewish, and so how is she appointed to a Jewish organization's role in combating anti-Semitism?
She's not Jewish.
She's not Jewish. Yeah, there was, and it was sort of, she put that to bed pretty quickly, I would say, because, you know, her whole point was like, racism is not a problem for the Black community to solve. Anti-Semitism is not a problem just for the Jewish community to solve. Like, we as non-Jews, you know, I'm speaking as her, that as non-Jews, there's a huge role to play. And she also grew up, she's very interesting. She is a practicing Christian, very devout Christian, but was appalled to learn of the sort of the role that Christianity played in fomenting anti-Semitism and, the Christ killer, imagery and all that. Anyway, like it inspired her to get into this work. She's amazing. So
there's a little buzz behind you or some kind of background sound.
Oh,
maybe.
I don't know what it is.
Sir.
Still?
Yeah, like maybe
it's like a ring. Like there's an airplane above you, maybe, or
you hear something.
I don't hear anything. I don't know what to do. Nothing. I have nothing near me that is buzzing.
That's very strange. Okay, we'll truck through it. It's. I have to applaud you for taking the decision, or for the AJC taking the decision to hire a non-Jew. I think that many people could look at that and say, okay, that's a weird decision or a controversial decision, and I think that, just like you said, I mean, in a time when, and this is going back to what I just previously said about how anti-Semitism exerting itself in different sectors of society typically represents a society that has some sort of a problem, that's in a decline, or that's in a decaying position. Anti-Semitism is definitely a problem that affects Jews, and Jews are victims of anti-Semitism, obviously, and of course. But I would argue that anti-Semitism is in a greater sense a problem of the society of which accepts it.
Absolutely.
And if you're a Christian or just a secular American, the anti-Semitism is coming from your campus, so to speak.
All is coming from inside the house.
Okay? Right. So
I think it's a sign of societal rot.
Right. It's a sign of your societal rot. And it should behoove you to go out and be the first person to try to, or the first people to try to come and say, no, we have to put a stop to this, because we're not these people. This isn't us.
So, I mean, that's why, I'll join you in applauding that move. And I think, just like how you see on the Black Lives Matter marches, a lot of white people marching with them and saying, we won't stand for this anymore. You don't see that many people standing, maybe you do, but not as many with the Jewish community when there is anti-Semitism, saying we're not going to accept this. And here you have an example of someone who did that in a very visible, very public way.
I would say, and the larger community, I think, stands with the Jewish community when terrible things happen. So after the Tree of Life shooting, AJC very quickly mobilized Show Up for Shabbat, where we called on Jews and non-Jews alike to go to synagogue, because people were afraid to go. And so we called on people to show up, and it became really a global phenomenon. It was really extraordinary. And the outpouring of support and love was amazing. So when these very overt, obvious acts of anti-Semitism occur, then yes, the community is always, we're grateful for the outpouring and the support we see. I would say the kind of, the more subtle, the shape-shifting side of anti-Semitism is less understood. People get it if there's a swastika painted on the side of a synagogue. They understand that is anti-Semitic, and they know it's bad. They don't understand why the sort of charges of dual loyalty or questions about, sort of George Soros type conspiracy theories and the globalist conspiracy theories. They don't really, their antenna are not finely tuned to that kind of anti-Semitism. And we're trying to make sure more people understand that, so that they can be more aware of it.
It's a tough one. I've had very close friends, not Jewish, grew up with me, came to synagogue with me as kids, are the most loving people of the Jewish community you can imagine. And, they've shared things about Rothschilds or things like that. And I point out to them, I say, do you know this is an anti-Semitic dog whistle trope, whatever. And like, oh, we really had no idea that, talking about Rothschilds is we didn't even know they're Jewish. We didn't know they're anti-Semitic. And you just kind of point out to them, people are like, oh, I really didn't know that. Like, because it's one of these things where you have to have historical awareness, and you have to have some more cultural awareness than the average person needs to have in today's America.
I've actually heard lots of Jewish conservatives talk about the globalists, not even realizing.
You mean Soros?
But use the word the globalist conspiracy.
Yeah.
That's a global,
so I mean, does that kind of begs the question, is there a point, if society doesn't insert anti-Semitism into one of these things, if my friend shares something about Rothschild and I point out and he says, oh, I didn't even know they were Jewish, is that anti-Semitic? Do we need to then be like, oh, maybe we're being too sensitive about this. You know, we're connected.
So that's also a really good question, Dan. I would say, I don't think your friend is being an anti-Semite if he or she has no intent, right? Like there's no intent. But what we also know is there's a huge amount of ignorance out there. And that ignorance is also not a friend to the Jewish people, right? Like where there is ignorance, there can be conspiracies, and where there are conspiracies, there are inevitably anti-Jewish conspiracies. Like it's just sort of part of the territory. We actually produced something called Translate Hate, which is essentially a glossary of these kinds of terms like globalist or, really dual loyalty, helping people understand the origin of those terms and the anti-Semitic connotations with them, and why we bristle a little when we hear them. And the idea is that we want people to be just a little bit more highly sensitized, not to be overly sensitive to it. And I think that, that's a point. There are times when it feels like, are we
we're like, looking for what to get mad about,
Are there other communities of dual loyalty that people look at other communities, not Jews, and say
Muslims, man, all the time?
Yeah, I think Muslims.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
before
sure.
9/11, was that a thing that people said about Muslims, or was it like was that a term that was thrown out solely about Jews in the American context?
I don't know.
Like, would people say to Mexican Americans, like, you're dually loyal to Mexico and the United States?
Well, if you remember some of the big immigration protests, I guess they were post 9/11. I'm trying to think if you're pre-post 9/11, but I remember living in Chicago, being at some of the big pro-immigration protests around the time when Obama was all this si se puede, like all of those protests, and people getting outraged that people were waving Mexican flags.
I remember that. You're right. I remember that if there's So yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it's unique to Jews. I just think
sure.
I think we, it is something, especially when you, there's so much, we're fascinating people, aren't we? Like there's so much that I think people don't know about, like the idea of peoplehood.
Yeah.
The idea that we are a people, that it's not just about religion, that it's not just about, an observance or practice of a religion, that this is something
a big challenge within the Jewish people, trying to get other Jewish people to understand this. So you deal with anti-Semitism. So you personally are the director of the regional offices. Can you just give us a breakdown of what this looks like? What does this mean that the AJC has regional offices? And then I know you also have global offices. So what does kind of the AJC national and global footprint look like?
Yeah. So our whole architecture, we're headquartered in New York. That's our main headquarters. By the way, when I moved to Kentucky, the joke was like, none of my New York colleagues remembered where I lived. It was like, how's Memphis or how's Lexington? Like they didn't know. They just couldn't remember. So the joke was that they knew I lived in not New York, but that was it.
Like flyover country.
Benny's from Minneapolis, and I'm from Indiana, and we're very used to not being from New York.
Right.
I feel like
I have New York parents. And it was
exactly.
We were different than the other Jewish community in the Minneapolis growing up because we weren't 100% from there.
You were from there, right? You're othered. I get it. Anyway, so we have headquarters in New York. We have a large presence in Washington, D.C. A lot of our political outreach, a lot of our diplomatic work is done there. But then we have offices in 24 U.S. cities. We also have 12 overseas offices, and we announced earlier this year that we'll be opening AJC UAE, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, I think Abu Dhabi perhaps, but really exciting. And then we also have partnership agreements with 37 international Jewish communities around the world. So whether it's the Jewish community of Morocco or Turkey or, Bahrain or wherever there are Jewish communities, AJC has these partnership agreements. And the idea is that we can help amplify their voice and amplify their advocacy voice, both to their governments, to other governments. We can serve as a resource to their community. The one thing that I would say that we are very careful about is we never presume to know about like what is best for those different Jewish communities. So if we wouldn't act or do something without first consulting with the Jewish community of that country. And I think that has been a really important aspect of our relationships with all of these different Jewish communities. So for the regional offices,
let me jump in here for a second real quick. So what don't you do? You know, you talk about dealing with different Jewish communities. Just, I mean, you know,
we're not funding them. We're not like, you know, there are social service organizations that are doing critical, important work to help ensure, you know, sort of food, shelter, healthcare, things like that. You know, for Holocaust survivors, for other Jewish communities. But that is really not what we do. We're more of an advocacy organization. So we do advocacy, diplomacy. We will engage on their behalf if and when they need us to. We will not engage on their behalf if they ask us not to.
Okay. So where do you partner with other Jewish organizations, Jewish Agency, the Joint, you know, local federations and local communities? Like, how does that interaction work?
Yeah, you know, we're part of the Conference of Presidents of major Jewish organizations. We do some interesting work with Israel Aid, and we do a lot of philanthropic and humanitarian aid through Israel Aid. So AJC is not directly giving to, you know, actually I think earlier today we announced we were through Israel Aid making a donation to help hurricane victims in Honduras. So it's not just Jewish communities that we help. Wherever Israel Aid is going, if there's a natural disaster or crisis, AJC, you know, very often is willing to help Indonesia or Egypt or, you know, Turkey, wherever. If that, not Turkey, if they will accept help from Israel Aid, but once upon a time when they would. What was the other part of your question?
No, I'm just trying to understand the dynamic. So I mean, let's.
Oh, where else we partner? At the local level, I would say, you know, our regional offices, and again, it depends on the size of the community. When you're in St. Louis, when you're in Louisville, like I am, like you can't not work with the Federation and the Jewish Community Relations Council. Mm-hmm. Sometimes there will be collaborative programs with, you know, other Jewish organizations too. But we're independent of all of them. We're not, you know, beholden to anyone. We're not funded in large measure by anyone other than our donors, which, you know, we don't receive any government money, you know, we do get some small federation grants in different communities that help fund some of the local initiatives and endeavors, but
and where there's some, let's call it overlap in terms of
areas of responsibility.
Sure, areas of responsibility.
Or ADL also does anti-Semitism, right?
Yeah.
APAC also does Israel advocacy.
Yeah. You know what? I think we've kind of all figured out that again, there is space in this for all of us. We have plenty of people within the AJC universe who are also supporters of APAC, who also give to a federation, who, you know, may support ADL, may support other organizations. You know, I think we see what we do. People are attracted to AJC for a couple of things. One, the level of diplomatic work we do makes us stand out. Most Jewish organizations are not engaged in diplomacy the way we are.
Yeah, I noticed that.
That's one. And our nonpartisanship, you know, our centrism at a time, and you asked this earlier, it's so hard. It is so hard, not gonna lie. Like we are in, you may have been aware of a little thing called a presidential election that we've been, you know, working our way through.
Part of. Wait, the president of what? What are you talking about?
Well, it's been quite a time.
I've noticed this. I've noticed this, and I was telling Benny actually before we went on the air. You know, you and I met because you were bringing. I'd love for you to expand on this. You were bringing up-and-comers, American politicians, up-and-coming politicians who you recognize as being prominent before they get there, and you bring them on you know, educational trips to Israel. And I've had the good fortune to speak to a number of these groups, a number of these politicians, and you know, everyone likes to say they're bipartisan or they're nonpartisan. You know, everyone likes to say they're centrist because, you know, that's kind of human nature, is right? I'm the normal one. And anyone
Dan, right now people really want to pick a side. I'm seeing a lot more of that, but go on.
Yeah. No, you can do better for yourself if you pick a side now.
I guess so.
And they just like stay on it really hard.
And what I noticed after one of these meetings, I think it wasn't the first meeting I did with you guys. I won't say names in case they don't. You could say names, but I won't. Of these politicians who are fairly well-known politicians, and I remember one of them said to me, kind of off the record, said, you know what, as a Democrat, I wouldn't be able to come to Israel with one of the other organizations. I won't say who. And it's another organization that also calls itself bipartisan or nonpartisan. And, you know, kind of struck me. And I took this back to the think tank where I work, and I kind of shared it with my colleagues. And so this is a really interesting, you know, sign of the times, and where, you know, I noticed as someone who, I'll call myself a friend of the AJC, but I'm not, you know, I don't work for the AJC, that I noticed the sign of the times is you're really walking that fine line. And what does that mean today, and how do you do it?
Yeah. Well, one thing I would say is for us, it's authentic. And I think that we can say that credibly. Whether it is the Trump administration, the Obama administration, the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, all administrations prior, all administrations that are yet to come, we will criticize policies that we disagree with, and we will praise policies that we agree with. So we are focused on policy, not on partisanship or personality or party. It can be really challenging. I recall with the Trump administration, on the same day, we both praised the announcement that the embassy moved to Jerusalem, and we were extremely critical of the policy of separating children from their families at the border. So on the same day, we can both praise something that we agree with and criticize something that we think is absolutely abhorrently wrong. Yeah. And we still get invited back to these, you know, we still have relationships. The other thing I'll say about it is what we recognized is it might feel good in the moment to yell and scream and be really angry and, like, you know, want to be part of the resistance or whatever it is, like whatever side you're on, you want to be the, like, you know, you want to yell. And many of our supporters, many of our leaders have, you know, their own very strongly held political positions. It's not like everyone is completely neutral. Right. But they understand that within the AJC world, in order for us to be effective, in order for us to be able to be influential on the things that we care about, we have to be at the table. And if we're not able to be at the table, then we're just sort of yelling into the wind, or talking to ourselves. And again, making ourselves maybe feel good about yelling, but like we're not accomplishing anything. So we've worked really hard to sustain and maintain relationships in successive administrations and across party lines. The legislation we support in Congress, we really support things. We very, very, very rarely will support anything that is not bipartisan. Like, we really want to see bipartisan work. We believe we are better when we're getting the best ideas from both parties, and when you know, when we're able to sort of live that out. It's hard though.
Yeah, you know, Melanie, that's such a hard thing to have to, like, navigate, right? Because we're in a time where everything is partisan. So you mentioned, for example, the Trump administration's decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem, which was not an idea that initiated at all with the Trump administration. That was codified in American law since the mid-90s under Clinton, and it just was deferred.
It goes back to Reagan.
Does it go back?
But nobody implemented it.
Nobody was never implemented. Yeah. But now, okay. So let's just say, use that as an example. You come out in support, and obviously we're supportive of that support of. We support
your support. We support our support,
and support us of moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and you know, we've said multiple times on this show, you know, it was very disappointing for us living over here to kind of hear the silence of a lot of the you know, American Jewish community over that move.
Oh, I wrote a scathing op-ed, and I rarely do this. You know, I'm not a scathing person. I don't scathe often.
He scathes in private.
And I wrote an op-ed in Haaretz in English, criticizing the reform movement. And you know, this was at the time when I put out the book on the reform movement in Israel. And I'm not anti-reform movement. I'm a friend of the reform movement. And I wrote this thing. I said, you know, you're trying to make inroads in Israel. You're trying to portray yourself as authentically, the Israeli reform movement is authentically Israeli and not like a foreign transplant. And then something happens in the Israeli context that 90% of Israelis are celebrating, and you don't come out and celebrate it, and you put out this very kind of, you know, wishy-washy statement that you wish it would have dealt with the Palestinian issue, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's like, just because it comes out of the Trump administration, you know, you have to, I think you said it just right. It's a very hard line to walk of dealing with the policy matter itself and not who issued it.
Well, I would go further and say that it's a decision that if you take nowadays, it might cost you some friends even by doing it. and saying,
yeah, for sure. And like another example, and let's go before Trump, the Iran deal, the JCPOA, AJC, after really serious discussion, study, meeting with top leaders from Israel, from the U.S. government, really trying to understand the ins and outs of what was being proposed, ultimately came out in opposition to the deal. We said, we think there are too many loopholes here, too many ways for Iran to nuclearize. It's not doing enough to prevent and really cut off the path to nuclear enrichment, but rather it's just saying, here's a longer on-ramp. We had other issues with it, but at the end of the day, after a lot of very serious, very, very, very heady discussions internally with our top leadership, again, it was not a quick decision.
Is it a Democrat? I'm just curious as you're saying this, and I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought, but is it the organizational culture of AJC, when you're taking a policy decision of such magnitude, is it a democratic process or a collaborative process, or ultimately is it, very few people have their agenda or their decision or whatever it is, and that's the way it'll go?
Yeah, it depends. On the one, we have an executive council. So ultimately it's really the executive council, which is comprised of senior management. I'm part of it, as well as our top national leadership. There are times when, if something is really consequential, we ask our regional offices to kind of debate it and weigh in. And that is part of the, that becomes part of the discussion. It's not a one vote, one region, one vote kind of thing, but we take their feedback, and we want to be representative of the, the sentiments, but the ultimate decision-making is really our executive council, our top national leadership. With the JCPOA decision, there are a couple things. One, at the end of the day, we had people who came out, they didn't agree. They thought we should support it. They wanted us to, support the Obama administration, really, and what the Obama administration was trying to do. And while they didn't agree with our decision, they appreciated the seriousness of the process. They appreciated the fact that they were heard. They appreciated the fact that, again, it was so incredibly thoughtful. We lost a handful of supporters over that, not that many. But I will also say, when the Trump administration pulled out of the JCPOA, we were critical of that too, because we said, we weren't supportive of this deal, but unilateral withdrawal from it is not going to get us, it's not going to help us here. Like, it's not going to advance what our ultimate goal is. We're really interested to see, and we're already in conversations. We want to be very much part of the conversations with the incoming Biden administration about what any possible reentry might entail or might look like, and what are the things we would recommend be revisited. We certainly wouldn't want to see the U.S. jump right back into a flawed deal.
We were just talking about this morning. Yeah, actually, Benny was asking me to kind of break it down, and that's kind of the position I took. Is I didn't like the deal when it was signed because it had way too many holes in it. But then once the Trump administration pulled out of it, I had an issue with that, not because they pulled out of it, because they didn't seem to have a strategy of re-engaging with Iran to get a tougher deal, which was the whole point of the move. And that's kind of one of these, again, these tough, nuanced lines to walk that even, to kind of have that kind of position. It's very hard to explain, especially when, it's become so politicized, when people were just, okay, I'm a Democrat, I'm going to reflexively back the deal. I'm a Republican, I'm going to reflexively.
Well, and that's kind of the thing, though, right? Like, most people out there are not looking to engage with the actual meat of what are these policy decisions. What do they entail?
Or tofu if you're a vegetarian.
Impossible. Impossible burger, Dan. They're just, okay, what's the party line? What's the progressive line? What's the conservative line? What's our tribal?
Yeah. Because we need cognitive shortcuts to get through life. Like, we talked about this before. As humans, you can't have a learned opinion on everything. I think we're just too limited in our capacity. So you have to look to someone, your rabbi, your political party, your professor, whatever it is, your TV talk show host, your podcaster. If anyone looks to us for
this is why lobbyists exist. By the way,
nowadays, it is why lobbyists, and we had the lobbyist episode,
sure.
And she said the same thing. And she said people don't have the time, so they look to someone that they think they can trust to give me my worldview.
Sure, but in the past there was, administrations or academia or whatever it might be, the media, they would encourage, and I remember the term, like the terminology, they would encourage a robust national debate of an issue. Now I don't feel like there is a robust national debate.
Do you think you're romanticizing?
I'm not romanticizing. I actually recall that there would be, you would have more than we live in a time where you have social media, sound bites, the attention span, it's diminishing. These are empirical facts that we can point to. It's hard to talk about something like the JCPOA in a 1 or 2 minute segment,
especially because it takes you a full minute just to say
JCPOA. It's a hard one. It's a very hard one. And when Israel or the United States withdraws or lobbies to withdraw from the JCPOA, the nuance of why sometimes gets lost, and people might look at that and say, well, are they advocating for war with Iran?
Right. That's what I was trying to explain to you this morning, is that no, being against the deal, it means you're against that deal. Doesn't mean, and I wrote this plenty of times. I'm trying to write it again now because you're hearing it once again. And I hate to say you're hearing it from the Democratic side because, I'm trying to come at it like AJC, like I'm trying to come at it from a centrist perspective of, looking at the issue and not who's backing what position, and saying, because you're, for example, the assassination this last week of the nuclear chief that is attributed to Israel. Allegedly, according to foreign sources. For people to say, well, that's gonna, if you're in favor of that, that means you're trying to torpedo diplomatic progress for the Biden administration, which means you're pro-war. No, that's not what it means at all. And we can do a whole different episode about that. We won't get into that with the AJC.
I think, one of the challenges, and you're alluding to it now, and just to return to the idea of why we take rising, elected officials and politicians to Israel, is because, and what we've realized is where we need to do more work is on the Democratic side. We know this, we know this. And I'm not casting any aspersions when I say that. It's just there are impulses and instincts and forces trying to, on both the Republican and Democratic sides, trying to make Israel a real wedge issue, which is incredibly dangerous. We know this, this. We think it's very bad for Israel. We think it is very bad to make Israel some sort of zero-sum thing that people are trying to, it's either we're either Israel's ours and they're against it, or whatever it is. When we take the trips, Dan, that you've met with have been mayors. So we've taken mayors, and I can say it since you won't, but Mayor Pete, we brought Pete Buttigieg to Israel about a year before he announced his run for president. We knew he was a rising star. We didn't know he was going to run for president, but we knew he had ambition. But we've taken.
I didn't want to say it in case some of them didn't want their trips publicized, but
yeah. Well, no, he's been public about it. Another who has been very public, Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles,
who's Jewish. Everybody should know that he's Jewish. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
He's Jewish.
He says he's a Mexa-Jew.
Jewish from
Mexa-Jew. Yeah.
He's an active. He goes to Ikar, which is a really cool community in Los Angeles.
Most definitely.
I think he just got a government post, a cabinet level post, if I'm not mistaken.
His name is, well, unless it happened today. Something happened today?
Yeah, I'm gonna
really?
I'm gonna look it up while we're talking, because
amazing.
On the drive home, I heard about this.
Huh.
Anyway, we had Garcetti. I remember group and Pete Buttigieg, and there were.
But we've also brought U.S. secretaries of state. We've brought state legislators. There is a whole. This is another one of those terms of art, but the idea of subnational diplomacy. So the mayors, the governors, the state legislators, the secretaries of state, attorneys general, they're all of these categories of leaders who in and of themselves may be important because they as individuals are rising stars, but also as collectives become an incredible important voice in American politics. So the other thing that I find incredibly fascinating, like this is what I'm so into mayors, sort of a joke with an AJC, like I'm the mayor whisperer, like you
really are though. You really are.
I'm the mayor whisperer. So we now have a partnership with the U.S. Conference of Mayors that a formal agreement with them that we will do an annual trip to Israel. COVID, ruined. We had such a good group that was supposed to come this year. Oh, kills me. I'm hoping 2021 we can assemble the same kind of just amazing group, like really, really, really cool people. Anyway, but
this might be a good time for me to say, we don't know each other. I'm the in the regular world, I'm the director of sales for Kenneth Tours, and we do a lot of political delegations and VIP delegation work. And what you're saying right now is just resonating, because we're all just like, well, we're out of work, number one, and number two, it's like this work isn't being done. It's
not being done.
You can't convey to and I'll say this kind of to the appreciation yet detriment of some of my colleagues in the field that are trying their very, very best to do wonderful virtual tours of Israel. Like, it's just not the same. Like,
it's not the same.
It's not.
It's not the same. It's a nice idea.
Just like we're not sitting in the room with you right now, and we would love to be in the room with you doing this podcast.
I would be drinking bourbon with you.
Right? There's something that's missing. Do they?
Well, hang on. Let me follow up on the mayors here real quick.
Well, I was going to say the mayors as well. I don't
go ahead.
Question the mayor.
You go first.
I was just going to say, and then Dan will follow up with his follow up to my follow up. Do they appreciate the opportunity to come to Israel, and how unique is that for them to be taken by an advocacy organization to a foreign country?
So if like focusing just on the mayors, they appreciate it immensely. First of all, one of the things that I think it's safe to say, if anyone has higher political ambition and they want to have some sort of foreign policy credential, a trip to Israel is extremely important. It's just an important part of one's political understanding, political education. And so an opportunity to do that is really important. The other thing I will say is that the AJC Institute that runs the trips is called Project Interchange. And we have a really great reputation among all of these different types of groups that we take, whether it's university presidents or politicians or African-American leaders or, whatever. Like we take many groups because they know they're going to get as balanced a perspective as could be expected. So it is still, they know who we are. We're not hiding the ball. We're a pro-Israel organization, right? Like we're not trying to like bait and switch anybody about who we are. But we make it really clear that being pro-Israel doesn't mean we're anti-Palestinian. We want you to meet Palestinians too. We want you to meet Arab Israelis. We want you to understand the complexity. We're not trying to present Israel as some utopia. We're trying to say this is a really complicated country in a very complicated part of the world. And in order to understand it, you have to go there and you have to experience it and you have to see it, and we have to confuse you. And if we don't confuse you, then we have failed you. Yeah, and so what we can guarantee them is they'll eat way too much. They'll have really long days. They will come home confused, and they will be completely invigorated by the experience.
I have to throw in a little bit of tourism humor here. Oftentimes when we have a very successful group, success being like went out without a hitch, one of the complaints that we'll get when I do a debrief with a tour leader, and they'll say this like it's a legitimate complaint: there was too much food. I'll say, well, what do you mean there was too much food? No, like there was way too much food. It was just
every time I sat down,
so much food. And we used to look at that like, okay, come on, like if that's all you have to complain about, there's really no complaint. But we realized that for many people,
they're not used to eating like this.
Number one, they're not used to eating like this, but there's a cultural difference between Israelis and Americans, whereby we look at that as, and I'll say it in Hebrew, like tarbut shefa, like there's an abundance of bounty, and you're a guest in our home, or you're a guest in our country. We want to shower you with these things, and they're looking at it like you're wasteful.
Just to be clear to our non-Israeli,
are you donating that food after we,
totally?
Just to be clear to our non-Israeli listeners, we don't eat like pigs or whatever the kosher equivalent is of eating like pigs on a regular basis. It's something you see at hotels and at banquets, is where you have that.
My in-laws on a Friday night.
Your in-law, anybody's in-laws on a Friday night. But I gotta say, very, very truthfully, the hotel food in Israel might be the best in the world.
Oh my gosh, the breakfast. Tell people, yeah, like part of our instructions to our participants is about breakfast. Like don't miss breakfast. You must not miss breakfast. So, like what we've seen through these trips is not only is there this sort of awakening that happens and this, deep understanding and appreciation for Israel's reality, for the complexity of the region, to deepen their understanding that the Middle East is not the same as the West, right? Like it is not the same. And sort of the way power is viewed and the role of Iran in the region, how that is understood is so important for our participants. So we bring European parliamentarians, we bring people from all over the world. My work has focused in the trips I've been involved with, especially the most recently are with US mayors, because again, not only are they individuals, rising stars, we're looking for these people who are, not at the end of their career, but, the earlier stages of it, but also the US Conference of Mayors as an organization is a body that foreign governments want to deal with. They want to deal with the mayors, right? So like an example, when the new president of Mexico was having his inauguration, and the relationship with the Trump administration was not great, they were much more interested in making sure they had, someone like an Eric Garcetti from Los Angeles, a major mayor or a delegation of mayors, of prominent US mayors, was more important to them as a group than having, the second undersecretary of Latin American Affairs or whatever it was from the State Department. So like as a body, whether it's the governors, the mayors, state legislators, they have a political voice and political power. And to me, it's fascinating. Like, let's get them engaged in some of the international work, right? Like, why not? They're not focused only on domestic issues. They have a role to play. And as the US over the last number of years was withdrawing from a lot of our sort of international cooperation and multilateral organizations, there were so many governments that were looking for other ways in. The State Department wasn't staffed the way they were used to. They didn't know who to call anymore at the State Department. So like, if they need another avenue into US politics and the US government, US spheres of influence, the mayors are one body, governors are another body. Like it's just this fascinating sort of next level of diplomatic engagement that I think is, there's something there for us to really tap into.
It really is, and again, I saw this working on the ground. I met with mayor delegations. I met with secretaries of state on the state level, which I didn't know existed.
Yeah. Everyone knows about them now because of the
election stuff.
That they're in charge of the election.
They're in charge of the elections.
That's really their big thing. They're in charge of record keeping and of the elections. I did not know that until I met with a delegation of them. I met with Hispanic leaders, which was a fascinating conversation because they brought a whole new perspective to this issue. And I met with a multi-faith group that had a decent amount of American Muslims involved, coming from the New York area. And that was a whole different fascinating conversation because it was taking place, there were African Americans, there were Hispanic Americans, there were Muslim Americans, Arab Americans in this delegation, and we were sitting in downtown Tel Aviv, across from the Kiryat, and literally on that same day, I don't think this was your trip, Melanie. This was someone else brought this group. Literally on that same day was the major riot by the Ethiopian community here in Israel because one of their members was shot by a police officer in a scuffle. I don't know how else to call it. And that there was a couple days of violent protesting in the streets. And so to speak to this group as this is happening in the country and try to, very expectedly, a lot of the discussion was, okay, let's talk about African Americans, Black Lives Matter, at the same time that we're talking about the experience of the Ethiopian community in Israel while they're protesting literally
downstairs. If you're doing it in
literally
Escalade,
downstairs.
It was in the junction.
Yeah, absolutely.
Below.
But I think it's really visionary of your organization. I don't know if it's you personally who came up with this idea or someone else in the organization, because, I think you hit the nail on the head. And so we're living in an era where two things are happening. And one is that national politics is more, what's the word I'm looking for? Traffic jam. What's that word I'm looking for?
Frozen,
Gridlock.
Thank you.
Gridlock. Yeah.
He knows me. It's more.
I knew where you were going. Yeah, nothing's happening. Not enough is happening.
More gridlock than ever. It's more partisan than ever. Congress can't seem to get things done. And it's the mayors who don't have the luxury. And I think they've said this to me, and you've said this to them. And you know, Pete said this on his, you know, presidential campaign. They don't have the luxury of being stuck in partisan gridlock. They have to get things done.
Exactly.
And when you're talking about someone like Garcetti, and the guy, you know, I had a great meeting with him when you brought him over and the entire delegation. He's a brilliant guy, but he's in charge of a city of what, 5-10 million people that has the second largest port in America, if I'm not mistaken, or the largest port in America.
Long Beach, yeah.
A larger economy than like most, you know, many countries.
A larger economy than most countries. So when you're talking about a mayor, you're talking about someone that can get things done. And I think that that's a brilliant move to go to the mayors, to go to governors, to go to the state level. You know, the United States, maybe some countries are more centralized in this matter, but the United States, a lot of authority rests on the state level. They really get to do a lot of what they want to do. You know, where you're talking about investment, you're talking about development, you're talking about trade relations,
and the individual citizen's day-to-day life is mostly affected by the
absolutely
by the state or local government.
So on that sense, I mean, I think that's a smart move. If you want to really then influence people and what they think about Israel and what they think about, excuse me, these kind of matters, then going to a mayor who directly influences whether it's 100,000 people or 1 million people, that's a really effective way. Secondly, I might add that in an era where less and less, you know, people might feel more detached from the national government. Nobody, you know, how many people know who the number 2 person at the State Department is?
Right.
You know, how many people know who the undersecretary for whatever is? But you know who your mayor is. You see them on the news every day.
The mayor's joke, something like everyone knows who the mayor is and like the football coach or whatever.
Yeah,
right? Like
exactly.
they
By the way, Project Didn't Change 2.0 football coaches.
Yeah.
You might, I'll give you the next idea there. But I think that's a really smart way to engage when a lot of things, seem backed up. And I saw it. I mean, I saw it again. I'm cheerleading from the side here. Got to see it a little bit in action. Got to speak with these groups. Seems to be working. And
yeah.
You know, kudos to you guys for thinking about it.
One other just quick mayor story. You know, we took a mayor in 2017. I won't name him just because I don't remember how public he was. Anyway, very progressive mayor, someone who is revered in the community of mayors as being one of the really smart mayors. He's very engaged and active in the U.S. Conference of Mayors. People turn to him. He's thought of as an innovator, you know, like not of a large community, but of someone who has prominence within the universe of mayors. And when we took him, I knew he was coming, you know, from a very politically left perspective. He challenged us on the trip, and I appreciated it. You know, at one point, he felt like they weren't hearing enough from the left. So we added a speaker. We added in a session. We got I can't remember who it was. We brought in a journalist who, you know, really represented the political left. And not only was he grateful that we were responsive to what he was asking, but he also, I think, really appreciated the evolution of the trip over the course of the week. And not only have we stayed in touch with him, but he has referenced that trip as being so powerfully important to him so that he knows what to say to the BDS activists in his community. So when they come, you know, encouraging him or asking him to support the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, he has an answer to them. And he has an answer coming from a place of, you know, coming from the left, coming from someone who identifies fully as, you know, being part of the left, but saying, look, I was there and here's what I saw and heard, and here's why I don't think that's the right way to go. You know, it doesn't, you know, I might support the goals of, you know, a better livelihood or future for the Palestinian people, but BDS isn't going to get us there, you know? Anyway, it works. It really does work.
And I think that's great because, you know, whenever I deal with these kind of things, whenever people ask me, what's the best medicine for people who you have that kind of progressive leanings and their surroundings are telling them to boycott Israel. And this, come here and see it for yourself. And it's not perfect. And there's a lot of mistakes and there's a lot of problems that we have as a society that a lot of us Israelis are not happy with and wish it could change. And a lot of us are working to change, but come here and look for yourself, see for yourself. And you'll see it's not anything like the BDS crowd that a lot of which has never been here and doesn't really know what's going on the ground. You had something you wanted to talk about regarding BDS.
Well, I was just going to add, like, or not add, I was just going to ask, when you're talking about 24 regional offices around the United States, and I'm just going to estimate that those regional offices are in cities that are, you know, with larger Jewish populations or with more influential populations. I mean, there's a the campus element as well. Does AJC operate on college campuses? Do they fight BDS where it starts? You know.
Yeah. Absolutely. So we do that both through our regional offices, but we also have a national director of campus affairs. We have a small department. It's not a huge department, so you know, some of it is being reactive, but through our regional offices, we're building relationships with campus leadership. We also do a project interchange trip for university presidents. And we were supposed to do one this year for deans of student life. We've done also trips for university provosts, but we're trying to identify the campuses either where we think there is a great need or in communities that are particularly important or university systems that we know, you know, where we think it would be really important. We keep in touch with those university presidents. We have seen in places like the University of Michigan where that relationship and that experience, like there was a very direct, clear line from the president's experience with us in Israel and being able to really shut down some serious anti-Israel activity on the campus.
Can you talk about it?
We're very mindful of free speech issues. We're not trying to criticism of Israel. You know, we you know, look.
What is on that note? What is the AJC's policy towards anti-BDS legislation?
So we have supported some anti-BDS legislation, but how it's worded matters. Mm-hmm. And you know, we have a legal department that is really has some expertise in this, and we have worked with some state legislatures to correct language in anti-BDS legislation that we found to be unconstitutional. Like we said, like let's not pursue something that's going to, you know, be killed, you know, the minute it gets challenged in court. Like let's try and do this in a way where it can pass constitutional muster. So
can we give our listeners who might not be familiar just a little background on this? I'm familiar with this, but if people who might not be in the weeds of you know, Jewish
anti-BDS, right? So there have been some state legislatures, also some governors have done this through executive orders, where they have passed laws or executive orders that make it illegal for. It depends on the state, but the state. I'm trying to remember the nuances of it. It's like the state entities. The state can't contract with.
The state can't contract with someone who supports
the BDS movement. It's a little tricky, and it has to be very narrowly crafted. You know, the idea, and the states by and large where this has passed are states that, you know, they're not like they're sort of solving a problem that doesn't exist. You know, sure. And it's more of a statement. Yeah. Nonetheless, we want to make sure that the statement being made is one that is constitutional. You know, we have done so much work on campuses. The other thing we're doing that I think is really important is we have a program called Leaders for Tomorrow, where we are training high school students. And again, it's, you know, sort of select high school students. It's not huge. We can't operate on huge economies of scale in AJC. We're not a huge organization. But we have cohorts of about 25 to 30 junior and seniors in high school. Now I think we're in 12 or 13 different cities where we're training them both to be advocates, both for Israel, but also to be confident Jewish advocates, so that when they get to their college campuses, they're prepared, they know what to expect, they have the right tools and language, and they also have us, so they know, you know, if they're facing a problem on their campus, they have allies, they have someone to call, they know who, you know, they have resources. Sure. So we're looking at BDS. We are not the leading organization trying to advance anti-BDS legislation in every state, although we've helped lead it and champion it in the state of Missouri. Our office was very involved in that. Once we get involved, our, you know, first priority is to make sure the language of the bill is drafted in a way that we can support. And then we want to make sure it gets bipartisan support. you know, again, for us, that's really, really important that we can show sort of a more unified front, saying that these sort of threats and attacks and singling out of Israel are unacceptable and contrary to American interests.
Have you engaged with, let's say, BDS supporting congressional representatives? You mentioned Michigan, for example.
In limited ways, yes. Yes, I would say in limited ways, not, you know, not always, like we may have some connections or relationships or efforts to be influential. We may have some sort of behind the scenes conversations. It's tricky. Again, we would rather, I think, spend our time and energy on those in the middle whose opinions are not yet fully formed.
Yeah, and I would say that Dan and I definitely recognize that it's not as big of a problem as the impression seems to make it out to be, in terms of their impact. If we're talking about,
we often come back to this, and especially when we talk to in Israel, you kind of have, you know, those kind of representatives in Congress, the 4 or the 5 or whatever representatives have
the squad.
They have a really outsized reputation, at least here in Israel. And I always get this question, but what about the squad? It's 4 people out of, you know, hundreds. But you know, I will kind of point out, going back to the nuance thing that makes it hard to point out. Yes, they have an undersized role, and they're really only a few in Congress. But the challenge that they represent to the Jewish community, the challenge they represent to U.S.-Israel relations, is a very deep one that's based on decades of revisionism. And again, we go back to this conversation about critical theory and post-colonialism and all of these kind of indoctrinations within the American academia that have taken decades to start reaping their results. I don't want to say success, but success for the people who want that. And to overturn it is going to take a similarly deep education effort to go back to classic liberalism.
And most people don't see it coming, though. Most people they don't see it coming. Yeah. They really don't. The other thing I would say about, you know, the squad, to their credit, they're incredibly media savvy. So even though they only represent 4 votes in Congress, they have huge platforms. I mean, AOC has how many millions of followers? Like, you know, when she says something, there are a lot of people who hear it. So their megaphone is outsized, even if their actual, you know, congressional influence is not. So yeah, you know, and again, as we said earlier, a lot of people don't have the energy or bandwidth or time or brain space to challenge or dig deeper or, you know, question their sources.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or learn for themselves.
I want to ask you,
have the capacity.
I want to ask you something that I don't know where AJC stands on this, but it's, you know, AJC is among the many American Jewish kind of centrist organizations that is trying to debate it. And that's I want to talk about kind of the what we call the growing rift between most American Jews and official Israel, because, and that's a nuance that I just threw in there for the sake of this question, because people always say the rift between American Jews and Israel, and it's not the case. It's a rift between most American Jews and the part of Israel that's been in power for the past, you know, 20 years, but it's not all of Israel. And I was.
But isn't it most of Israel?
It isn't most of Israel. It's, if you call 60% most, but that means there's still 40% of Israel that's not.
Right. Plurality.
But I was fortunate enough to speak on this at an AJC, the Global Forum last year. So it's an issue that does concern you. It concerns, I think, basically the entire organized Jewish community. How are you viewing this kind of developing relationship, this rift, this trend of where most of American Jewry is going and where you see kind of Israel going?
It is a challenge for sure. I think that it's going to be a generational challenge, right? Like there is a greater need in the younger generations for them to see and experience Israel. And again, I would say kind of warts and all, the way we try to show people Israel. We want them to understand Israel is not perfect, but I think that what we often say is Israel has democratically elected leadership, just like the United States. Sometimes you like the elected leadership of another country, sometimes you don't. but that doesn't mean you reject the country wholesale or whole cloth just because you may not like whoever is in power at the moment, even if he or she has been in power for a long time.
Let me throw a proverbial wrench at you. I don't know if you'll be able to answer this in your AJC hat, but at least I'll say it out loud. Israel's elected leadership, it's Bibi, but it reflects a trend, and it reflects a trend in Israeli society that, due to a combination of continued conflict and demographics, and we kind of often like to sugarcoat it, Israel has gone rightward over the years. It's shifted. It's become a little more nationalistic, a little less liberal democratic in the way that it used to, a little more populist democratic, a little more. I don't want to overstate that. And that's not something that sits well with most American Jews. Again, it sits well with about the 30% of American Jews, but it doesn't sit well with the 70% of American Jews. And I mean, I'm not sure there's much we can do about that. I honestly don't see a situation where Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz are getting elected in the next elections. If anything, Naftali Bennett might get elected.
I would go further to say that I don't think that if Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz were elected, that would, please.
Why not?
The 70% of American Jews, because I don't think that Benny Gantz or Yair Lapid represent the values of the Meretz party. I think that Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid are way more. I think that centrist Israel, to a certain extent, is not going to be in line with some of the values of the progressive Jewish community in the United States.
Yeah, I think centrist Israel is still far to the right of.
Yes, I agree with
many in the American Jewish community.
Yeah, I think centrist Israel lines up with soft right America. I would say.
What I would say is I think that's up to us to try and help American Jews understand Israel's reality. Like, Israel is the Israeli electorate didn't get this way, overnight.
Exactly.
Like, it's a reality that is, born out of where Israel is and the situation Israel finds itself in and the reality Israel has to deal with. We don't,
and also where Israelis come from, right?
Yes, exactly where Israelis come from. We are not sending our kids into the military, right? Like, we are not, like, we have to understand that when that Israelis are voting to, it is very much about self-preservation in a way that most Americans can't understand and don't understand. So one of the things we do at AJC, we have a contemporary Jewish life department that Dan, you spoke on the panel with Steve Boehm. Steve retired. Steve's amazing, sort of legendary within the American Jewish, sort of an American Jewish historian.
Sure, absolutely.
He retired earlier this year. And so there's the woman who is now in, as the director of the Contemporary Jewish Life Department, Dr. Laura Shaw-Frank, is picking up Steve's mantle of trying to look at Israel diaspora relations, and really specifically American diaspora relations with Israel, and try and figure out, like, what is it we need to do to deepen that understanding? Because what you're describing is a reality that we have to confront. We can't ignore it. Yeah. We can't ignore the fact that the two largest Jewish communities in the world seem to be moving a little farther apart. And we have to figure out how to create bridges. We have to figure out how to at least deepen the understanding so that there's a sense of, if we as Americans don't like how or why Israelis vote, we need to understand how and why Israelis vote, sure. Right? Like, we can't just assume that we know better. We're not living there. We're not sending our kids to the army. We're not facing the threats that Israelis face. So we're very aware of it, and it's something we do talk about. We've actually talked about, like, do we need a project interchange trip for American Jews? But that's not where we're going to spend our money. I will tell you what we're doing. Laura is going to teach, starting in January, an internal AJC University class on sort of Israel 101 for our leadership, for the people within the AJC universe, so that they understand Israel's history, they understand Israel's reality. Again, I think we have to do our part to make sure that we are educating our own, so they understand. Like, again, it doesn't mean we have to agree on 100%, like, but let's at least understand where it's coming from.
That's a great point. Do you think there's a different understanding among those American Jews who call themselves Zionists AJC and a lot of the other organizations, and how Israeli Jews call themselves Zionists, and what, and if so, what does that mean?
I don't know. Like, I'm thinking, like, when I call myself a Zionist, what do I mean? Like, I believe in Israel's right to self-determination.
Right. So I'll give you an example. Benny and I both made Aliyah. Okay. We did.
Where are we?
Do you know where?
We're not in Kansas anymore, Benny.
No, I'm a little different.
We watched Wizard of Oz this weekend. Sorry.
I'm a little of a different story because I grew up in a house with an Israeli mother and a father who had made Aliyah, but I grew up mostly in the States. But you made Aliyah, you know, and I chose to come back to Israel as an adult. And most American Jews don't make Aliyah. Most American Jews who call themselves Zionists don't make Aliyah. So what does it mean? What does it mean for an American Jew to say they're a Zionist? And why doesn't that translate? A lot of Israelis ask this question: if you're a Zionist, why aren't you here?
Why aren't you here?
You know what? Yeah. How do you have that kind of split, that kind of dichotomy of those calling themselves Zionists who say, yes, I absolutely support Israel, I'm a Zionist, I love Israel, but I'm going to stay here? Like, how does that work?
I think there's symbiosis, right? Like, I think it is symbiotic because Israel needs the diaspora and the diaspora needs Israel. You know, I feel like we as a Jewish people need the state of Israel. We need to support it. We need to do what we can to make sure it is thriving. But Israel without a diaspora would be much more vulnerable in different ways. So I think there's a real symbiosis there. I think, you know, what I don't think we can afford to do is have a huge swath of the diaspora being, you know, apathetic about Israel or disengaged on Israel or unaware of Israel. You know, I grew up in a very Reform home, not a particularly religious home. You know, we were part of a Reform congregation. I had a bat mitzvah. You know, we did Shabbat some Fridays. You know, it was sort of like we were sort of typical American Reform. But I also grew up in this very deeply committed Jewish, you know, to the Jewish people, to this notion of our Judaism, to this is our heritage, and with that came a, you know, sort of ingrained Zionism that I learned from my grandmother. You know, like, it was just sort of part of my upbringing, was to understand that Israel mattered and Israel was important, and that as Jews, like, Israel was part of who we were. We did a family trip to Israel when I was, 16 with our synagogue, like so many American Jews do. And it was totally transformative for me, you know, really powerful. So, you know, I think we need both. I think we need Israel, and I think we need a strong, committed diaspora. When the diaspora becomes apathetic or, you know, stops caring, then I think that question really starts to matter even more. But I think if you have a diaspora and you have people who are engaged and sort of fighting for Israel and trying to represent Israel and Israel's interests and trying to help people understand Israel around the world, then it's good for Israel.
I'm going to ask you another simple question in a second, but before I do, we have a few people watching the live stream, and if they do want to throw on a question on the chat function on the YouTube, they're welcome to do that. So please feel free. We'll try to get to that. But so, you know, do you see a difference? You talked about, you know, when you grew up, that kind of being pro-Israel and that sense of Jewish peoplehood. That was ingrained in how you grew up. And something that I found that is less and less common among millennials and younger American Jews today, even the ones that do very much embrace their Jewish identities, is less of a connection to Israel, or at least more of an openness to very much criticize Israel, to question its importance. I mean, maybe that's because they were born and grew up in a time when Israel has always been strong militarily compared to its threats. They don't remember the Holocaust. They don't remember 48. They don't remember 67. They might not be completely Jewishly literate as to history and et cetera. How do you find, I'll ask this in two ways. Give us your take kind of on the generational shifts happening in the American Jewish community, you know, versus millennials and younger, and then Gen X and older, because I think that's where we're starting to really see the split, both from your personal perspective, travel around to a lot of Jewish communities, you engage with a lot of Jews, you're on campuses, etc., and also kind of from the AJC's perspective, if you will.
Yeah. So I think you just described it. You know, I think that there is the generation that has grown up knowing only an Israel that is perceived as powerful, that is economically thriving, you know, that is putting so much innovation into the world. Like, what, you know, there is this sort of like, do they really need us? They're so like, they're doing just fine. And I think, again, I think that's why we have to be very intentional about creating a sense of connection and connectivity. I think we as Jewish parents have to, you know, it's got to start in our homes. We have to start ourselves. From an organizational perspective, again, we have a whole young leadership department that does everything from our campus work, Access, which is our young leadership program, sort of post-college, under 40. 40 is such an arbitrary number to decide that people are like younger, but whatever, you know, we're going with it. And then the LIFT program, which I said, which is our high school program. You know, we're trying to do two things with these. First, we're trying to instill and deepen the sense of Jewish identity among young people who are, you know, who are future leaders. We, you know, again, we're sort of a grass tops organization. Even within our own ranks, we're looking at like, how do we get the rising stars within the Jewish community to really connect to Israel? So we want that first and foremost. We also want people to stay engaged with AJC, by the way, like throughout their lives. Yeah, like we need it too internally. It's not just for Israel, but like we have to make sure we have that
development work.
Do you find, but how do you find the, let's call it the approach to Jewish identity among younger Jews? Again, I don't want to say 40, let's say 40-ish and younger versus the Jewish identities of Jews 40-ish and older, which is more or less millennials versus Gen. Do you see a difference in how they approach Jewish identity and therefore how they approach Israel?
I think there is a generation now that is on college campuses now that are confronting some of this, the real BDS, like the really sort of overwhelming shock that they face when they get to campus and see how bad the anti-Israel sort of sentiment can be, not always, but can be. That is actually, it's not the way we would want people to turn to their Jewishness and understand Israel, but it is driving some young people to want to understand Israel better and want to engage more and say like, wait a minute, like I'm completely uncomfortable in these circles and I need to be a better advocate. What do I do? And so they're deepening their own education and their sense of connection to Israel almost defensively, which again, it's one way to do it. It's not the way we would prefer. We would like people to you know, come to it from a place of joy, you know, as part of their upbringing. Generationally, I'm trying to think. So I'm very Gen X, right? Like I am like right there in Gen X. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I remember on my college campus there would be like random anti-Israel protests, but they were small and they were sort of over there and no one really, you know, it wasn't a big deal. It wasn't an overwhelming sentiment. And I think, you know, what we see now is that there is sort of the like checklist of
no, but that's like the joke, right? Like the boomers were on one side, like very, very, very passionate about the 60s and you know.
We were just sort of slacking, right? We were like,
millennials over here were like, everything's really militant. And then the Gen X is like, dude, I want to pay my mortgage. I got kids.
Yeah, it was slackers, right? Like, have you seen the things about like when everything went to Zoom? You know, it's like the Gen Xers are finally like, this is our moment. We can just like work in our sweatpants.
Procrastinators of the world unite.
I love working from home. I wish I could do more. No, my question.
Come full circle.
We're wearing pants.
We are wearing. We're fully clothed. No, I actually had to go to my office today. That's why. No, my question is broader though. Forget the anti-Israel movement for a second. Let's assume that that's not an issue here at play. Are you finding, I don't know, maybe you're not seeing this, but are you finding that younger adult Jews engage with their Jewish identity and with the role Israel plays in their life different than slightly older Americans?
Yes. In what way? I mean, yes. And I'll tell you how else we see this. We see this through some of our leadership, some of our lay leaders who say like, I can't get my kids who are, 28, 29, like they want nothing to do with any of the Jewish organizations that I'm part of, not just because like they don't want to do the same thing as their parents, but because I can't get them to be interested. I can't get, people who are deeply committed to AJC and to the issues we work on, including Israel. We hear that they struggle with getting their own kids to connect. Again, I think the farther away, I think you said it, Dan, the farther away that these generations get from crisis, trauma, the less they see that, like the less they understand that or have lived through that or have seen, it becomes abstract. It becomes an abstraction. And there is a big world with all kinds of terrible things happening and all kinds of causes to get behind and very, sort of righteous things to do. Like there are a lot of very righteous, noble causes that people can get involved with and put their money and resources and time behind. And Israel seems to be doing just fine, like I do think there's an issue there.
I think aloud, and maybe either I'm crazy or I'm just a few years ahead of this, but is it really so bad? I mean, can we as committed Jews, as the ones who care about Israel and their Jewish identities, can we get to that point in our identities now where we say, you know what, Israel's doing fine. Most of the Jews in the world are really doing fine. We can militarily handle really any of the threats that are coming at us. We can financially handle any of the threats that are coming at us. In most of the countries where Jews live today, we live pretty securely. And the ones where Jews are not secure, the rest of the Jews in the world can help them. We have 2,000 years of trauma baked into our DNA, but maybe these like younger Jews that I'm looking at are kind of like, you know what, we're past it. We're not there. We're not the traumatized Jew. We're this kind of new Jew. And I God forbid, I don't want any more traumas to befall the Jewish people so that we have more traumatized Jews. And maybe the price to pay for that is that, yes, we're going to lose Jews to assimilation because of it, because it's safe to, engage with the world in a different way.
I would say, if I'm answering the question, I would say, not only am I okay with that, I think that that's the type of thing that reflects more of the reality of today than some of, some other narratives might want it to be.
What do you mean?
And what I mean by that is simply, okay, if I take my work, for example, when I'm commissioned or something like that to write a program that shows Israel to a group of Jews from the United States, maybe it's a development group that's coming from a Jewish federation. Maybe it's, a donor group or a chairman's mission or something like this. The narrative that maybe is trying to be, and I don't want to be delicate when I answer this, of course, but like sometimes the narrative that wants to be given is that Israel needs your, needs your support. And then people come here and they say, well, I don't understand. You're trying to show me the startup nation. I saw Tel Aviv with massive skyscrapers and, Maseratis and Bentleys in the street. Like, why am I giving you guys money? And where's and of course, that's a very simplistic reading of things. And there's many elements of Israeli society that still, very much need support. But, we are at a place where we're no longer, we're not miskinim. We're not looking for.
We're not downtrodden anymore.
We don't need the handout as much as we've become accustomed to asking for the handout. We don't need it. We're in a better place. And I think that as a Zionist who lives in Israel, I don't want to be a part of a country that has a real culture of today, a culture of being a schnorr, of being with my hand up. We are a dynamic, vibrant, successful society. Sure, we have places where we need to improve. But I think that for us, the embodiment of the Zionist ideal at this point is like, no, we've succeeded as a Zionist.
That's
model.
what I'm saying. Have we gone
and we can invert that and say it's now our role to come in. We see that there's Jewish communities abroad that are in need of help. It's our role to give back.
I think so.
And show the model of
I don't want the outcome of this thought to be, okay, you know what, American Jews and American Jewish philanthropy, you can stop engaging in Israel. Thank you. I don't mean that to be, because I think
maybe it's just changing the narrative about what like the philanthropy doesn't have to be, it is no longer, collecting pennies to give to the Zionist project or I mean, look, it's lovely to plant the trees, like I have an aunt who has planted probably half a forest, like every event in our lives, I get a tree. It's beautiful. but like
groups of people that come here and they want to see their trees.
They want to see their tree.
It's like, where are my trees? I'm like, there's no sign.
Do you remember the Saleh Shabati movie?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Planting the tree.
That's when you just pointed. There it is. It's right there. I think, I think things are going to potentially, we're seeing this sort of rapid escalation of normalization through the Abraham Accords, which is exciting and good. And again, back to like, there are people who are unwilling to praise anything this administration has touched because they don't like this administration. But I think we must acknowledge the role of the Trump administration in what is a extraordinarily monumental shift for Israel. I mean, it's Israel too.
I would even go further to say that that's going to be something that AJC and other organizations have to and will, and I'm excited that they will, get in and show to American Jews who otherwise might be hesitant to get on board and try to support the Abraham Accords because of its connection to the Trump administration. We've talked about this multiple times. I'll give you an example. I was talking to a colleague on the phone. He's in Michigan, and I won't say his name, but he's a very committed pro-Israel type of a guy, but he's also very, very, very progressive. And I mentioned some of the activities that the UAE Israel Business Council was doing, and that we had this great Jewanced live session where we talked to a panel of Emiratis that were excited about the Accords, and
I listened to a good part of it. It was great. Yeah.
And he in his response was like, "I didn't know that was legit." I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, I knew that you signed, Israel signed an accord, the peace agreement, but like I thought it was like it was going to be like a cold peace. Like, is that really happening? Like these people are really excited to be." And the point is not that he didn't understand that it was something that, or he didn't educate himself to know the reality. It was that on the merit of it being a part of the current administration's
it was so politicized.
And probably through the echo chamber of his news sources.
Right. He could not fathom that it would actually be an authentic situation. That clearly, if it was Trump, that it was something that was, anytime
to be viewed with suspicion, right?
No, it was to him. It was actually, he used the phrase. He said, "I thought that was fake news." like people to people encounters would that must be fake. Like that's just something they're saying.
I like to tell people even a broken clock is accurate twice a day.
That's right. We've been applauding all of these advancements and all of these new accords. We applauded just earlier today on Twitter that Saudi Arabia has granted the airspace so that all the Israeli tourists can go to Dubai and eat in the kosher restaurants of Dubai now, which is great. But back to the other point though, I think like this kind of normalization, I think the more normalized Israel gets, it will change the dynamic in terms of how diaspora, again, there's less need, right? Like there's less need to defend Israel's place in the community of nations. The more Israel becomes a natural part of the community of nations.
Exactly.
The less it's besieged.
Yeah, exactly. And the more it can, again, I don't want to minimize the role of American Jewish philanthropy because at the end of the day, it goes to very good causes here that can't work without American, and not just American, diaspora Jewish philanthropy. But those things could come from Israel too. Israeli philanthropists are not doing enough here. The Israeli government funnels a lot of money to causes that, I won't pick out the causes, but that don't serve the entire public, but only serve parts of the public. And we've kind of gotten used to this reality where American Jewish philanthropy funds a lot of these things that, I'm glad for them because it helps them have the connection to Israel that they might not otherwise have.
It's just not a sustainable situation.
But it's not sustainable. And I think we here need to step up our game.
That would be a really good podcast discussion.
I think it is. I think I can.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of how this turns into another book. Israel Diaspora 3.0. That's
yeah. No, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. We're not there yet, but it's I see this as progress.
I got to ask you a question. Let's take a step aside from all this. So what is it like? I spent a little bit of time in the organized Jewish world. I'm kind of on the sidelines of it now because I'm in a think tank that's involved in the organized Jewish world. I go to conferences here and there. What is it like to be a woman in a very senior position in the organized Jewish world that, I don't know if it's true or not, but at least has a reputation for being male-centric or male-dominated?
I will answer it in two ways. There's the AJC, like the experience I've had within AJC, and then the experience of the sort of larger Jewish community. Within AJC, like AJC has been amazing, really, truly. And if you look at our senior leadership, our CEO, David Harris, you know, is a man, but at least half of the senior management team, if not a slight majority, are women.
Interesting.
The head of our Israel office is a woman. The head of AJC Europe is a woman. Like, you know, we have women in very senior positions throughout the organization. And I was made director of our Washington, D.C. region when I was in my early 30s. I had come from the Chicago office. I was sort of unproven in Washington. This organization, and again, just speaking as, you know, someone who works for AJC, has taken so many chances on me and has never, ever, ever, I've never felt in any way that I have been stymied or stifled by virtue of gender. You know, I've had experiences where early on, apparently, I found out about it later, when I was interviewing for my DC position, one comment that was made was like, well, what's she gonna do with that hair? You know, like comments about like, oh, like, but like I've never experienced, I would say there have been a few times where I felt like I was being bullied a little bit, not from within AJC, but by others within the organized Jewish world. But I've always felt supported by AJC, which has been hugely, hugely important. And I know, you know, again, I know AJC has my back. I have to say, I feel very lucky. I have not felt that I have been held back. The other thing, you know, again, this just sort of, I think I don't know, like I have visible tattoos, you know, I have certain things about me that are like, I'm a little bit like of a non-traditional, like sort of organized Jewish communal professional, whatever that means.
Totally are. And when I first met you, I was like, yes, who is this awesome person?
But I think it helps me, you know, I think like, again, I think it, I don't know. I think it has only served me well that I am not like, whatever. I don't want to, I'm, you know, I don't know what a stereotype is or what it looks like.
There has to be mold anymore. I think,
I think that's cool. Do you see, you don't have to name names, but do you feel there are other places in the organized Jewish world that women are limited today in 2020?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's still not enough women CEOs. Like if you look around the organized Jewish world, there are a handful. It's getting a little bit better. You know, and I still like the other thing I'll say is if it's a panel of, you know, 3 or more people, when we're doing webinars, by and large, AJC tries to make sure that either like one of the panelists is a woman or there's a woman moderator. Like, you know, I think there's a sort of consciousness about wanting to make sure that we're not just seeing like groups of men sitting around talking to other groups of men. And I will tell you, there were times when I was in DC where there would be groups of men, delegations of men who were from, you know, country, whatever, different countries who would come in and like I would almost insist on being in the room, not because I needed to be in the meeting or even because I had the time, but because I was like, I don't want it to be a room of men. Like I'm going to go in just as a statement to this delegation from another country that like women have a seat at the table here too. So, you know, I think there are subtle ways that I have certainly, I'm very conscious of it. And I've tried to make sure that others' consciousness is raised. But within AJC, I think it's an incredibly like evolved organization, which is.
I'm thinking of something, and I'd be interested to hear your opinion on it. In a time of uncertainty like we have with COVID, when many Jewish organizations are downsizing, what would you say to the next generation of people that are looking at perhaps going into a career in a Jewish organization?
Well, a couple things. One, again, to the immense credit of AJC, we have withstood this pandemic we've frozen open positions, but we haven't had lay anybody off, which is pretty amazing. We've had no furloughs or layoffs. It's pretty amazing. I think if you are looking for it, you've got to find the organizations that are nimble, that are creative, that are innovative, that can pivot quickly, that are forward looking, because those are the organizations that I think are going to sustain and still be around. The ones that are not stagnating or stuck, or who have been willing to kind of compromise themselves in any way. I don't know. I feel like there are organizations, and I would say AJC is certainly, among them, and certainly at the top of the list, top of my list, but that are going to be around. They're figuring it out, and again, it's about being innovative and being nimble and being able to anticipate what is coming next. One last quick example. So in addition to AJC announcing, AJC that we're opening an office in the UAE, a few years ago, David Harris asked the question, and I give him such credit for being, this kind of leader. He said to our intergroup relations, interreligious affairs department, what is the single biggest challenge in intergroup relations? And the answer was Muslim-Jewish relations. And so rather than run away from that, we invested in it. We created a department. We have a director of Muslim-Jewish affairs. We have an assistant director of Muslim-Jewish affairs who is Muslim. We have leaned into the things that seem the most daunting and the most challenging, because we know that otherwise we risk irrelevancy if we're not willing to take on the issues that are the most pressing. So I would say, look for organizations that are bold and taking risks, and doing things that, are going to challenge assumptions, because that's where I think the future is.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I'll give you guys credit. I think we can both give you credit, because we know a decent amount of this world from different perspectives, and I've at least always been impressed by how you guys do this. And we're kind of in an age where there are a lot of legacy institutions that maybe still have money and are trying to figure out what it is they want to do. And you guys, everyone kind of has to figure out what they want to do. And you guys seem to be a little bit ahead of the ball, making quick decisions and channeling that. We'll wrap up with this. If people want to get involved in a lay capacity, in a volunteer capacity with the AJC on a local, on a national level, if they want to fund it, if they just want to donate their time, maybe because they can't donate money, or if they want to, participate in the webinars and conferences and these kind of things you're doing, how can they find you? How can they reach out to you?
Thank you. So ajc.org is our website. We have an amazing, we had a webinar today. We do a ton of free virtual programming called Advocacy Anywhere. We had a program today with 3 voices from Jews who were from Arab countries who were exiled. So we had someone from Iran, someone from Iraq, and someone from Libya. Amazing, gut-wrenching personal stories. The story of these Mizrahi Jews was just unbelievable. Anyway, we have a whole lineup for the rest of the week. We have tons that you can do if you want to just learn more about us. We have tons of resources on our website. We also have our list of regional offices. So you can either reach out to them, you can reach out to me at pellm@ajc.org. But we are always looking for support. We're looking for engagement. We're looking for people to come on this journey with us.
Awesome. So Melanie Maron Pell, we thank you very, very much for joining us today. And we're so glad we got to have you on the show.
Thank you. It was great.
And yeah, take care of yourself. And yeah, we hope to see you back in Israel sooner rather than later. I think hopefully by the middle of next year.
And we wish you,
fingers crossed.
We wish you and the AJC a lot of luck in the very important missions that you've taken upon yourself for the Jewish people and for Israel and for America, really. I say that in a very sincere way. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good luck in all you're doing.
Great. All Thanks, guys.
Take care. Jewanced is a joint creation of Benny Shoulder and Dan Pfefferman. Make sure to subscribe on whatever platform you get your podcasts.
For more information and show notes about this and previous episodes, visit us at Jewanced.com and feel free to hit us with your comments and suggestions. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you back for the next episode of Jewanced.